Well, it's 11:32, so I'll go ahead and get us started. And Ryan has shared the link to our presentation in the chat, so you can have access to that if you'd like it. And so today, Ryan and I are going to share with you some information about OER basics and talk specifically about a grant that is available for you to create some OER resources for your own classes at MTSU. As an entrance to our presentation, we thought it might be useful for us to share a little bit of our own stories and lived experiences and how we each came to OER individually. So for me, as an academic and as a researcher, I came to open access and OER through a series of frustrations with access to factual information on the internet and the high cost of academic journals. And after becoming fully indoctrinated and on board with the open access movement within research, I moved into using OER textbooks and OER materials in my courses.
Yeah, for me, similarly, I came to OER through some frustration. We worked in my department, my program, to put together a custom textbook with a publisher, and we thought it was going to be great for students. And then we got to the first day of class and students couldn't access it, and the price was higher than what we had expected. And we spent, a quarter of the semester trying to figure out how to get students to be able to use the textbook, and it was completely irritating. And so we went to OER initially as kind of a stopgap, an easy, high quality solution that would be beneficial to students. And since then, it's just been a fantastic thing. And I see the value for students pretty much every day.
So in today's presentation, we're going to take a couple of minutes to review the purpose of our grant that was recently given to us through TBR in December of 2020. We'll talk about the definition and values and how those define our work, both in the grant and in hopefully your own adaptation and use of OER resources at MTSU. We'll talk about the frameworks and benefits of OER, a few of the facts and fallacies that often surround OER resources and tools. We'll talk about the 5 R's of OER and some repositories where you can find OER resources for your work. And then we'll take a couple of minutes to talk about the information and the people surrounding the grant that we're going to be inviting you to apply for, and briefly go over some additional workshops that are coming up through the LT and ITC over the next month or so.
And that's where sort of we'll start, is that this is the first of 5 or maybe 6 workshops that we have scheduled about OER. These come out of this grant that Erica just mentioned, but really what we think is OER is a fantastic tool for teachers. And so we want to just get a bunch of information out about OER to give you information about it so you can decide if it works for you in your classes.
So we think it's a great thing to start with the definition of value so that we're all starting from a common place. And we define OER as teaching, learning, research materials that are either already in the public domain due to copyright or licensed in a manner that provides everyone with access in order to retain, reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute. And this comes from the Creative Commons website, and we're going to talk more about those 5 R's later on in the presentation. At the heart of OER, open pedagogy, open access, are the values of inclusivity, access, and equity. And one of my favorite quotes that comes from the Association of General and Liberal Studies is that accessibility is being able to get in the building, diversity is getting invited to the table, inclusion is having a voice at the table, and equity is having your voice heard at the table. And we really view OER as a tool for increasing equity and access. And we hope that through our presentation today and through providing you more information about this grant, you'll find this to be a useful tool for increasing inclusion and equity in your own classes at MTSU.
There's a couple of frameworks that we think sort of inform the use of OER. And let me also say here, some of this information that we're going to share today will be weird or confusing or new, and it might be the case that we don't share it in a way that's super clear. So feel free to, as you're listening, write questions in the chat. And we will address those as we move along. We don't want this to just be sort of static information that we're thinking that you need. We want, feel free to help direct our information giving here. So the first of the frameworks is adopt, adapt, create. And so what this framework is it's a way of using OER. So OER is a set of resources that's freely available and in the public domain, right? So in this framework, it's levels of use in some ways. The most sort of easiest level of use, the lower level, is to adopt something that previously exists. The next level is to adapt something, so to take something that previously exists, modify it or change it, and then use it in your context. And then the most sort of labor intensive level is to create OER yourself. We're going to talk about each of those throughout this presentation here. But it's important to know that OER works in a couple of different formats at the same time. The next framework is one that has some linearity to it, and it moves towards sort of different use of OER. So first we can talk about open access. So OER is accessible sort of to anyone and everyone freely. So this is distinguished from sort of large subscription services to resources or inclusive access to textbooks, things like that. OER is intentionally open and open to anyone sort of at any time. Open resources here, this means that we're not talking about simply textbooks. We're talking about a whole lot more than textbooks. We're in this presentation going to focus on textbooks because they're sort of the easiest to conceptualize as a teaching resource. But OER as a category includes quite a bit more than textbooks. It includes homework services. It includes pedagogical, like lesson plans and teaching guides. It includes a whole bunch of stuff. But we're focusing on teaching textbooks here. And then the last thing is to think about open pedagogy. Open pedagogy is sort of at the bleeding edge of teaching and of open. And what it does is it intentionally involves students in the production and creation of sort of published resources for the intention of creating new knowledge and new information. And so what you have is, or an example to help you conceptualize open pedagogy, what you have is students who are through a semester working as authors of resources that'll be used later in other classes. Sometimes this is distributed through like Wikipedia or something public like that. Other times it's intentionally sort of collected and published in an open way through a textbook or through some open press books kind of book. But for the intention, explicitly for the intention that students are creating information, and then later students are going to use that information as a basis for their own learning. And that's, again, at the bleeding edge. So there are several benefits that we find of OER. The first one, well, we can talk here about benefits to students and benefits to faculty. So student benefits, we're going to talk about savings in textbooks. It works out on average at a national level to about $120 a course that students save. On average, nationally, we're looking at a yearly cost of textbooks of about $1,200. In Tennessee, the cost for textbooks annually at four-year college is a bit higher. It's more like $1,500. That's a lot of money that students are spending. So as you already know, right, college tuition is increasing rapidly. So are the indirect costs, which include textbooks. So sort of managing and maintaining the cost is a benefit to students. The other benefit of OER, there are several benefits. Another benefit is that it's easy access. Students have access to OER textbooks before, during, and after courses. We're not talking about sort of rentals and subscriptions. We're not talking about temporary access. We're talking about perpetual access, and not just to students, but to students plus anyone that they want to share their resources with. This gets into the value of OER, and we might make some connections here to sort of the age of misinformation. Erica mentioned it earlier, but this is a way of sort of getting accurate information disseminated more widely. When it comes to sort of the educational benefits, back there for a second, students who are using OER are less likely to drop or avoid classes. We'll look at that more in detail on the next slide. And then we notice that students perform as well or better using OER as traditionally published materials. On this slide, what you can see, this is a study. It's a really important study from the Florida Virtual Campus, and it's from 2016, so it's a couple of years old. I've provided a link to this study in the notes of the Google Slides presentation, so I would really encourage you to take a look at it yourself. But what we see here is 2/3 of students choose not to purchase a required textbook when it's expensive. And that is interesting because most of these students know that it's going to affect their grade, and they're making that choice anyways. To me, in my view, that's a systematic problem that we need to figure out how to address. OER figures out how to address that. It's an equity issue. We also see that half of the students either take fewer courses or don't register for specific courses because of the cost of textbooks. That impacts degree progression, it impacts retention, it impacts all of the success metrics that at MTSU correlate with our funding model, right? And so that's really alarming and interesting. And then the last thing to say here is this study here, the link is in the notes too, but this study says that what OER does, it concludes that what OER does is it improves course grades and sort of learning, if you want, for all students. And it's sort of disproportionately beneficial for students who are sort of traditionally underestimated in our learning systems. So it's got really important and impactful benefits that relate to equity.
And so I'm going to pivot for a second to some of the fallacies and facts in comparison to one another that sort of surround OER resources. And I'm focusing specifically on faculty's impressions. When we're unfamiliar with something or when something seems scary, we have a tendency to default to assumptions and base our understanding on fears. And so we wanted to address the four sort of main facts and fallacies around OER. And the first one is a really important one, and that is academic freedom. There is a belief that using OER resources infringes on academic freedom or faculty autonomy. And while I could understand why it might feel that way, actually OER and open pedagogy actually provide additional options for faculty members and create opportunities for faculty members to become the subject matter expert within their courses, not just in their materials. The second fallacy that we often encounter when we're talking about using OER is resource quality. And there seems to be a correlation between high cost and high value in our minds. And if something costs a lot, we think that it's worth a lot. And so because OER resources are free and therefore increase access and equity, they're often sometimes seen as not as valuable as some costly traditionally published textbooks. But the reality is that they're written by faculty and they're just as high quality, even though they're free and they don't cost as much as textbooks. And they're often even of higher quality. They're written by faculty who are experts in their field. They're often updated more frequently, and they provide up-to-date information, sometimes faster than traditional publishing models allow. The third fallacy that we often encounter around OER is that labor compensation for the creation of these free resources is uncompensated and therefore unethical. And the fact is that the creation of OER resources is often compensated through non-traditional models and avenues like reassigned time, extramural grants, and other administrative structures that are facilitated by administration at universities that value open access and open education. So our grant that we're going to talk about today is an example of this kind of labor compensation. And the last fallacy, not the last, but the last one we're going to cover is instructional support. So there is a fallacy around OER materials and textbooks that they lack the kind of instructional support or ancillary materials that often come with textbooks and high cost materials that come from traditional publishers. And a lot of times, especially in math and sciences, we see students and faculty relying on pre-built assignments or other instructional resources that are provided through textbook companies. OER provides these supports in a different way through community-based networks and resources that are designed and shared through repositories. And we have a list of repositories on our website, and we're also going to share those repositories with you in this presentation.
Hey, Terry, you had a question in the chat. Can you, I'm not sure I follow your question. Can you expound on that real quick? You're on mute.
Okay. Well, I just said back up. You kind of zipped through that thing about it being illegal. About there's a fallacy about it being illegal because it's not compensated. So
unethical? Yeah.
Oh, I thought it said illegal.
Let's see.
Yeah, I think it's unethical. We're just, I think that what we're trying to talk about is, making sure that faculty
unethical.
get compensated fairly for their efforts.
Okay, so if a faculty member wanted to have like an outside web page of their own where they dump stuff for the world to use, that's fine, right?
Yeah. And what I would say too is if you want to do that, you can license it using a Creative Commons license and make sort of the broader use of it more explicit and more permissible, more legal, I guess, if you want. Creative Commons licensing is not something that we're necessarily going to talk about in this presentation, but it's super easy to get a Creative Commons license that allows people to reuse and take care of, like you tell them how you're okay with them reusing your information. At the broadest level, they can kind of do anything with it. And then there's much more restrictive levels to it as well. Thanks. It's a good clarification. Okay, so let's talk again now about some repositories and the 5 Rs. So the definition, right, starts with the 5 Rs. We've already given this definition, but we just wanted to put it back on the screen so you could see it. These Rs are really important, and it's important that we take a second to look at them. So the first of the 5 Rs is to retain. Open education resources give the sort of user the opportunity to retain the information or the resource perpetually, right? So it's not limited use, it's sort of unlimited use. It gives the opportunity for that material to be reused in various contexts, right? So this is sort of, I don't know, if you want overlapping concentric circles, something like that of open. Reuse, it can be used in different contexts. Often it can be incorporated into different publications. So reuse is a broad category. Remix, it means something like mashed up. It's kind of like revised, but it's not sort of changing the text. It's putting the text into a different order or with different pieces of open text, something like that. So you can create and tailor resources without having to sort of re-edit and do all of that. So it's in some ways similar to like creating a custom edition of a textbook where you reorder textbook chapters. It's kind of like that, except maybe a little bit more remixy, I guess, if you want. The next level R is to revise. You can take and revise and change open educational resources. An example of this might be there's a chapter that you really like, but it uses examples that you don't think are going to match or mesh with students here at MTSU. You can change the examples, whether that's sort of the names in the examples or the description. It doesn't matter. You can revise them sort of as you need. And then the last thing is OER gives all users, the ability to legally redistribute the resources as they see fit. So whether that's sort of you as a faculty member, you can pass it on to students legally, or students who can pass it on to other students or family, it doesn't matter, right? It's a broad permission to reuse stuff. And all of this, again, is covered under Creative Commons licensing most frequently. There's a set of repositories. So here's Erica, can you go to the next slide just a second? The thing with OER, right? Remember this framework. We're talking about the ability to adopt, adapt, or create. This is not saying you need to rewrite or revise or write fresh textbook resources and have them, or learning resources and have them published openly. Part of what you can do in this is sort of adopt stuff that's already created that you think will be useful for your students. So, all right, if you can go back up. So there's a set of resources or repositories of previously existing OER that you can sort of examine and decide how to use yourself. So these are all things that you can reuse because they're OER. So we have stuff in the Walker Library. OpenStax is a group out of Rice University that's been sort of at this game for a long time. They've created a ton of really useful, widely respected OER resources that often include a lot of instructional supports directly from them. And then you can see the rest of this link. These are all active hyperlinks. So, I'll share the link to the slides here again in just a second, but take this and explore these repositories. There is likely stuff that's useful in your discipline or for classes you teach here. The one clarification that I want to make is that the LinkedIn Learning thing is a repository of resources that it's not OER, but it's free to our students because we have a subscription to it here. So it's sort of not OER, but still useful and may be helpful for filling in the gaps or getting some content to your students.
Yeah, so we're going to shift from talking about the theory of OER and talk a little bit more about the application and the TPR grant that we have available and what kinds of opportunities you guys can have for yourself and for your classes and programs. So the steering committee for this grant is Dr. Cheryl Torsey, Ryan and myself, Suzanne Mangrum, Kim Godwin, and Bud Fisher. And we wrote the grant together and submitted it sometime last year from Ryan's back porch, and socially distanced, of course. Mm-hmm. And we were awarded the grant in December. We've selected an interdisciplinary faculty advisory council that's going to help us recruit and select grant applicants from across the university. And we're delighted to have these folks represented with us. They're listed on this slide and they will be listed on our website shortly. Our website's still under construction, as you can see, but it is very shortly going to have all of these things listed. But if you have questions about the grant, or if one of these folks is in your home department, definitely reach out to them and get more information. Or of course, you can reach out to one of the steering committee members as well. Our grant, Embracing Equity Through OER, is first and foremost seeking to make MTSU a more equitable and inclusive campus. And so we're doing that through encouraging instructional innovation through the use of OER. And very shortly, we're going to send out a CFP inviting grant proposals for adapting, adopting, and creating OER resources. And this is the first workshop of 6 workshops that will give, or 5 workshops that will give some additional information about how to apply, where to apply, and all of the sort of nitty-gritty details that you'll need to see if you can get a little extra compensation for your classes or program. The proposals for the grant levels that we're going to offer should be submitted by an MTSU employee with the intent to use OER. And I'm not going to read the slide to you. I'm going to let you, it's available in the link to Ryan that Ryan has submitted. So that's there for you. The grants are going to be 3 levels. So small scale alterations are for one single course. Medium scale is exactly what it sounds like, and the large scale is for gateway courses. And I want to, before Ryan talks more explicitly about the different levels, I want to remind you that our levels of grant, the sort of small, medium, and large, are built around these OER frameworks of adopt, adapt, create. And so you'll see that they grow in scale and impact in alignment with these frameworks.
Yeah, so it takes work, right, to change course materials. We understand that. And that's sort of where this whole micro grant, I guess, if you want, or faculty grant project comes from. So if you're interested in using OER in your class, we'd like to provide you some compensation for changing your course materials. At the first level is this small scale. It's a single course adoption where you're adopting previously existing OER materials for use in your classes. So you can see the details there. The second level is more medium. It's going to be used by multiple classes, and it is a more thoroughgoing use of OER. It moves through the class in a way. It's not just adopting a textbook. It's a little bit more than that. The third level is a much larger scale. This is at the program level, or it's at the level of creating new OER for courses that you have. Our timeline, right, as Erica mentioned, we're talking about getting applications in April, awarding grants in May, doing the instructional redesign over the summer for fall deployment, I guess, if you want. Okay, so yeah, all right, that's next. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're good. So we do have a couple of upcoming workshops in the LT and ITC. The next one is on February 25th. I'll give a little more detail about that in just a second on adapting, and creating OER. Workshop 3 will focus on using OER in class. Workshop 4 will focus on selecting an OER text or resources for your course. Workshop 5 will address specifically what it means to embrace inclusivity through and with OER. And then the 6th presentation is less of an infrastructure presentation and more of a celebration and an announcement of the people who have won the grants for support of and development of OER resources. The next workshop that we would really invite you to attend builds on some of the foundation that we've put together in this presentation for you, and talk specifically about using OER materials in your courses. And so you can go ahead and register for that on the LT and ITC website if you haven't done so already. And we hope to see you there. So we're going to open it up for questions and discussion. And
yeah, we want to start with 2 questions. And so, you know, we've rushed through a bunch of content, obviously, but we rushed through it to get to this conversation. So we can circle back to any points that were unclear or anything that you'd like more information about. But if you can just take a second and think about these 2 questions, I'll read them, and we'd like for you to put your answers in the chat just as a way to start the conversation. So what benefits do you think OER would provide students in your classes or your students? And then the second one is sort of, why wouldn't this work? What are the challenges? What's difficult about adapting, or creating OER for your class or in your department or for your program or in your discipline? So we'll give you just a couple of seconds to think about that. And if you wouldn't mind to type in the chat, that'd be fantastic. And then we'll sort of commence with the discussion from there.
so Joan says, I see many benefits for adopting OER. The only drawback is the time it takes to find them or create them. Another person says, the specific courses I teach are time relevant, where textbooks are usually out of date by the time they're published. I already use as much OER as possible to give students relevant and up-to-date information and content. Vicky says, diversity of content from other disciplines and providing more interdisciplinary learning environment for question 1. Also, use of works that we don't know are available to enhance the historical foundation of theory. Terry says one benefit is that we get more relevant materials that aren't outdated. Nisha says, oops, I lost the chat. One sec. Says, I would like a free textbook option for my gen ed literature class. It bothers me to have students pay $100 for an anthology. Totally. Casey says, we have high enrollment general education course in health and wellness that, and have found enough reliable OER to make this a better option than $100 text.
The second question, somebody asking for a reminder, what are the challenges? Why don't you think it would work in your specific context?
Yeah, so people are answering these questions really nicely in the chat. We also invite you to talk openly with us about some of your answers to these questions. It's nice sometimes to get the answers in the chat so you can kind of get an idea of what other people are thinking. But we also invite some open discussion about these questions and about concerns. Terry says technology access would be an issue. Yeah.
I'm going to put a link while we're continuing to think. I'm going to put a link to the OER textbook that we use in the class that I teach, which is University 1010. And I'm explicitly adding this to provide some context to Terry's question about technology and access. And the thing that I'd like you to do, if you're interested in it, follow that link and you can see how easy it is to access the textbook. The whole thing is available in HTML online. And then also underneath sort of the cover, there's a whole bunch of downloadable options. And one of the things that users of OER find is that students are accessing the textbook in a couple of different sort of technological ways at the same time. So they might read it in HTML in class, and they might have a PDF or have it on a Kindle or some other electronic reader at home. But so in a strange way, oftentimes OER provides more flexibility in terms of technology, and it allows students to sort of pick their way through technology instead of having a certain platform imposed on them. And I think that students really appreciate that agency.
Yeah, I appreciated Julie's comment about the benefit of OER and involving students in content creation to support their understanding of themselves as scholars and to understand that they're capable of contributing to ongoing conversations. That's a benefit that I see in my English courses where I use OER as well. I think that's really important to think about and lends itself to an open pedagogy approach too.
All right, what other questions do y'all have, or what should we sort of get back to that we glossed over too quickly for you? The reason that we want to leave time for questions is that OER is a significant paradigm change, right? It's a different system. It's potentially working towards different goals. And that kind of paradigm change takes time to think through, and it takes time to sort of process, right? So what questions do you have? What challenges are you envisioning? What things do you need to know more as you process this kind of a change or potential change? And as you're thinking about that question, I would also say that this is, an option for you. It's not something that we're necessarily imposing on you. Right? I don't have the power to impose anything on you. So it's an option.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
This is Vicki Harden. And maybe because this is really cool and novel to me in some ways, but when we're looking at things like, we get paid to develop a course, let's say an online course, we get that money to do that. Our understanding is the university owns that course. How is that sort of meeting with this concept and this philosophy that if the university, quote, owns the course content that we've developed while we're being paid on university time, is that completely like a separate thing, or is it like you said, this is sort of a new idea and we just need to figure out ways that we can bring these things together?
So yeah, it's Trey Martindale, who's the new executive director of MT Online, probably can better address that question than either Erica or I can. So Trey, I know that you just answered the question roughly in the chat, but do you want to unmute and just give us an answer for a second?
Yeah, I would thanks. That's a really good question. I would just say our current course agreement the faculty sign is weighted pretty heavily towards the university rights as opposed to faculty rights. And so we're working on that now. And I can't say definitely that something is going to happen, except that we're trying to make something happen. So I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, but I'll just say we're working on that right now.
Yeah, so we'll get, as sort of that question gets answered over the semester, we'll provide updates in the sessions that we have. Okay, Kevin had a question in the chat. Costs, this presentation, I think, mentions that the costs of textbooks have a negative impact on learning. Is there any research that students will actually read OER content if provided at no cost? My sort of rough answer to that is, I think it's less about selecting OER and more about how OER are used in class, right? So if it's completely unconnected to the class and sort of unmonitored, I think students just have a hard time reading it anyways, whether it's traditionally published or OER, because it feels like it's not sort of important. So I think it's more of a course design decision. When you take OER towards the extension of open pedagogy, what you get is the textbook becoming sort of an essential place where students are writing to learn and learning from other students as they write. And they're sort of participating as creators of knowledge. And that makes the whole reading and writing process more critical and more centered in the class. So in that environment, students are definitely reading more. But I don't know that there is evidence to say that just assigning an OER and not changing sort of the ways that textbooks are used in class has any impact on what students are reading or not.
Yeah, that gets into more complicated structures, right? Because the only way we can measure if students are reading textbooks is by assessing the knowledge they may get from the textbooks. And that is a different question. And if we were to track whether or not students are clicking on something or opening something, then that is also a different issue. Terry, you had your digital hand raised earlier. I want to make sure we get to your question if you still have it.
Well, somebody said something about who owns the material. And so I was just wanting some more clarification on that. So, for example, I write a lot of problem-based learning events, and I've written them for a lot of different disciplines, you know, engineering, nursing, education, business, what have you, and provided those basically for colleagues of mine that wanted to use them in their class. So where I'm coming at with this is, if I do that, continue to do that, is it something that would go through this kind of a thing, or do I need to do this, like I said earlier, off campus on my own and just make that stuff available to the world?
So I'm not sure it's quite the dichotomy. I think that both are related and both are possible. And I think that sort of the way through it is to start licensing the stuff that you create as through a Creative Commons license. And then it's just a matter of figuring out where to list it. And as soon as you license it as a Creative Commons license, or with a Creative Commons license, you're telling people how it's legally permissible for them to use your content. But in every Creative Commons license, sort of, you get attribution for that content. It doesn't, that part of it doesn't go away. So then you can look at different repositories. So whether that's a website you create or the list of stuff that the MTSU library has, or a class shell inside of D2L, that's just a mechanism of dissemination. So, but I think the whole thing starts with Creative Commons licensing. What other questions do you have? Terry, it's a great question, because we're all trying to figure out sort of what to do with our work and how to get the most people to sort of value and make sense out of and use the work that we think is good. Yeah. What other questions do y'all have?
We also welcome those who are already using OER materials to share their experiences with us and to talk through how they went through the adoption and adaption or creation process. Ryan shared a link to his textbook. I'm happy to share a link to mine. I'm screen sharing at the moment, so I won't do that. But does anyone want to share their experience with using OER already at MTSU?
That's what I was going to ask is who's doing this now and do they have examples they'd like to share? That'd be great.
Yeah.
This is
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
so this is Richard Tarby. I use OER materials now. I don't necessarily use textbooks because the electives I teach really aren't too well based with textbook materials such as healthcare management and supply chain management. I do use a lot of OER simulations and case studies in my graduate and undergraduate classes. I've written a few. Interestingly, I've never pursued the licensing. I've just written them and used them in my class, and some other professors have used them, I think, kind of like Terry has mentioned. The one challenge I've had really is with non-traditional students who like to have something in their hands to read. I've had this in the MBA program quite a bit. I'm in the business school. They actually have to go print it, especially if it's a 30-page case study. They're not too thrilled about that. But if it's an online course, it is what it is. But not having a textbook in some of my classes and the on-campus versions of the classes, I've had some pushback of actually not having a physical book to hold. You got to work through that. There's really, I tell the students, there's really not much choice there. The best thing is I typically, if I am using a very long or a part of a book, I typically use parts of textbooks in some of my classes. The students have the ability to print off the chapter I'm using, perhaps. Most of those are pretty lenient in allowing what you to print. Sometimes you can't print everything that we need to print, but then I don't advise they print 150 pages anyway. So the responses I've had from students have been very good. Usually in my course feedback information, I get a lot of comments about having relevant time-bound examples. So I worked in the healthcare industry for 22 years, so I'm able to use some of those examples along with what I can find out in OER to give problems that are based on companies that students already know or they've already heard of, or at least relevant in the news. Of course, with healthcare, I'm blessed with COVID-19, gives me ample material right now to write cases and find cases and all kinds of material for students. So that's just kind of a rambling couple paragraphs on how my students have reacted. Overall, it's been very positive. I've had a lot of comments about, gee, I'm glad we didn't have to buy a textbook.
Yeah, it does become kind of a cost-benefit analysis in terms of the cost of the materials and whether or not they're usable for the majority of your students. And I imagine that varies by semester too.
The other thing that I think is interesting about what you said is that you're selecting chapters from different textbooks based on what's sort of the best for your students. That's, in my view, that's a unique benefit of an OER approach. And you're not going to be able to ask students to purchase 3 or 4 textbooks to accommodate that if you're using traditionally published materials. Trey put in the chat a link to a company that's publishing OER books. That's super common. That when you publish an OER book, the costs are really inexpensive, usually under $20. There's a lot of companies that do that. So that's another way of sort of getting that physical artifact to folks. And here we're talking, we can combine these two things. We're talking about adapting stuff, right? You can look at, 4 or 5 or whatever number of textbooks that sort of work for your discipline, and you can put chapters together and create in some ways a new OER product that you can have then printed on demand for people who want that. So there's a lot of really interesting and creative applications of this strategy. So really cool. Yeah. Hey, Joan, would you talk for 2 seconds about the way you're using Wikipedia in your classes? Wikipedia came up earlier, and I think that what you're doing is particularly interesting.
Yeah, sure. And this is a class for Buchanan fellows. So as their final project, they have to choose, they work in groups, they choose a newly published translation of a novel, and then they create a Wikipedia article for it. And so in doing so, they have to learn how to create an article. in Wikipedia, and they have to think about what reliable sources are, and they have to learn what a neutral way of writing is, and all kinds of, besides just the computer skills that you have to learn in order to put the page together. So it's been a really, really exciting project that we're doing every year. And we're building resources in Wikipedia as we go.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And I think the kids get a lot out of it. They tell me that they call their moms and say, "Mom, I'm published." So it's pretty
That is
exciting.
so awesome. I would love to see some of those Wikipedia pages. That's really exciting
Oh,
work.
sure. Sure.
So, there's this there's this connection, Joan, with what you're talking about. I read this book. This is not what I thought I'd talk about, but whatever. It's important, I think, at this point. But I read this book on the future of land grant universities that Gordon Gee wrote a while ago, and he made the observation that in general, the public interacts with the university only through sports. But by doing some of this publicly facing scholarship, it provides other ways for our public to interact with the university. And I think that that's really fascinating and potentially really important for what it is that we're doing here. Yeah. Trey talks in the chat about the loss of royalties from publishers. This is something that we're talking about explicitly on the steering committee of our grant because it is, the royalties are not large necessarily. In large classes with lots of adoptions, the royalties can be quite substantial. And they often can be tailored to go back to a department, not an individual, and then they can provide supplemental professional development and stuff. So that's something that we're talking about. I know that Bud Fisher has done some stuff in his college to sort of mitigate that. I don't know if you want to talk about that for a second, Bud.
Yeah, so we've done a few things. We've talked about ways to at least fund the departments to take care of with the losses in those cases. So if we were to take a book and it went across a whole group, we would figure out how to give them what those royalties were so they would still have those funds to work with. And we've started OER in the college where faculty can be funded also to do OER. We're at square one. So we're at adopt, but we're working in that regard and we're trying to get people on board to work in that regard.
Yeah, great. Thank you. What other questions? We have 11 minutes left in our hour.
I had one, Ryan.
Yeah.
The question I always get from my faculty is, where do I start? Where do I start? Where do I start? How would you tell somebody to kickstart it if they were interested?
Yeah. I'd ask some questions, and my questions would start with, what's the process that you use to arrive at the textbook that you're currently, using in your class? Because there's some process. What's the criteria? How did you select that? And then I would say, go to OpenStax and put one of their textbooks in conversation with the textbook that you're currently using, evaluate it by that same set of standards, and decide if it's worth using, right? And there is a cost benefit analysis at some point, right? So when you evaluate these OER versus traditionally published stuff on the same set of criteria, one of the criteria, at least that I think about, is cost. OER is going to come out ahead on cost. It might not come out ahead on everything, but start with some things, just evaluate it. And if you don't like that OER book, look at a different one. There's tons of stuff. Not all of it is going to suit your fancy. That's fine. But I would say the place to start is by evaluating some OER stuff in conversation with the textbook that you're already using. Joan, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, my colleagues in French and I are we have already been dreaming about and talking about creating our own materials to replace the really expensive textbooks. So is this the kind of project that you're hoping to encourage?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Simple answer, but yes, we'll make sure that you get more information about the grant as we sort of get the applications together.
Okay, super.
Who else? Other questions?
Julie's got something interesting in the chat. Julie, do you want to talk more about that on your mic?
Sure. When I was at the University of Louisville several years ago, there was, I think it was actually like through the library, a copyright librarian who coordinated course packs. So if you had readings you wanted to pull from a certain source, you would go through that individual so that they could get copyright approval. And obviously what you're talking about would not require that. But I'm just thinking that some faculty are reluctant to adopt completely electronic resources for students. They might want them to have those hard copies like Richard was talking about earlier. And if we just say, well, go to, Blueprint, and Blueprint isn't expecting faculty to come and do that, or there isn't some sort of a process that is established and made clear for how this would work, what the timeline is, all that sort of thing, it might not go very well. So I just think it might be beneficial for the steering committee to explore that and make faculty aware that these don't have to be wholly online resources, but they could be printed and students could do that at low cost and then have them to mark up and bring to class and use even when they're not online.
Maybe
really
Julie,
good.
that points to another fallacy that we didn't include, which is that OER equals digital, because it doesn't. It's a way of, it's more copyright than it is a mode of dissemination, I guess. Yeah, Erica, I cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I was just going to say, I think that's a really important thing for us to consider. And I think maybe we'll take that up in our next weekly meeting and talk about what that process might look like, because that is a potential thing to include in our workshops and to include in sort of a process recommendation.
Kim, you've mentioned in the chat that you're correlating OER with UDL. Can you just give us 2 minutes on how those two sort of fit together in your mind? You're on mute.
Should unmute. Sure. So UDL is Universal Design for Learning, and it is embracing the overall concepts of meeting students where they are and providing different types of learning materials to help them process information in the best way. It is a little bit about accessibility. It's also a little bit about meeting students in their way of learning and how they learn best. So it's not just thinking about print textbooks, and by print, I mean like words. It's not just that, it's about thinking about how you're gathering your resources and committing those resources to students in different ways that utilize different resources and senses. So in my courses, I'm very intentional when I am looking for my resources about finding things that are auditory, that are visual, that are kinesthetic, that really do connect with students in very different ways in order for them to connect with that material and make processes for further integration of information. And I can show y'all if y'all want. It's up to you if you want to see one at some point.
Yeah, I think at some point we need to explore those connections because when we talk about open education as OER as sort of a mechanism for increased accessibility, I think we have to pair that with UDO. Universal Design for Learning is UDO. Yeah. All right, Cheryl, you mentioned in the chat that the bookstore is fronting OER, the new Barnes & Noble bookstore. Can you just say something about that really quick?
Yeah,
as we sort of think about different ways of getting this around?
Sure. When they put forth their proposal, when we had the RFP, when our Follett contract was expiring, they put OER front and center. So I think we could easily approach the bookstore manager and say, okay, guess what? We figured out how you can support OER and ask them if they can help with printing and binding, keeping the cost down or how they manage it at other institutions. And I'm happy to do that, make that call.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
All right, any other sort of parting shots, last questions? I will say that this conversation at the end has been very helpful. It's interesting to see sort of the ways that we're thinking about OER similarly and differently across campus. I personally, I would say I'm excited to work at a place where on a snow day, we can get 30 people to talk about things that sort of influence student learning and make sort of what we're doing in the class more accessible and open to students. I think that's really significant, and it speaks to sort of the many advantages that we have here at MTSU. Yeah. Erica, do you want to say anything by means of conclusion before we end this?
Nope, I did it in the chat while you were doing the verbal conclusion. We're
Awesome.
good. Thank you all for coming. We're glad that you're here.
And be on the lookout for more about OER. We'll keep you informed.
Go play in the snow.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank
Guys.
you.
See you guys.
Thanks. Very good.
Thank you so much.